So I believe it's World Mental Health Day today, and I released my book about my tortuous decade or so of experiences with the so-called mental health services this year in June on my birthday. It's called Gaslit by a Madman, and there's 3 volumes. The main one is on philosophy, madness, and society. And it's a complete diatribe, um, really, you know, ranting and raving, and taking on not only the subject of madness, but the style of madness, and using it as a self-conscious aesthetic in many ways. Because, of course, madness is a very aesthetic kind of subject, and you see it often in films in ways which are have some sort of ambiguous appeal almost. There's the there's of course the typical axe wielding psychopath, but then there's also various types of strangeness that you get, for instance, in the films of David Lynch, where reality it verges on a dream world. The line between dream and reality becomes blurred, and you get characters doing things in ways which would commonly be easily be considered schizophrenic or psychotic um, by so-called medicine, the mainstream medicine that we have today in psychiatry. And Edgar Allan Poe said that there's no beauty without there's no great beauty without a tint of strangeness in it. And you see this strangeness, for instance, in the films of David Lynch, and it obviously has a huge appeal to many people. Otherwise, they wouldn't flock to his films. He wouldn't be the revered, avant-garde kind of maverick filmmaker that he is. So I mean, it almost seems surprising to me that I don't know. You perhaps don't see this, very often in philosophy, and treatise form in the way that I've done it. You do quite often see, borderline psychotic or mad characters, perhaps narrators in novels, etc. But you rarely see the molding of discursive philosophy and madness in the way that I've done in my book. So it could be just that I'm a little parochial in my knowledge of philosophy and the history of philosophy, etc. And this has been done many times before, but it just wasn't. It just wasn't in obviously the very major great philosophers, so I perhaps don't know about it. But but perhaps this has an originality to it, and I mean, there are kind of quite a lot of more kind of literary works which border between philosophy and literature, and may or may not also incorporate some kind of some kind of madness as well. Um, the novels of Dostoevsky, obviously. If you read like the notes from the Underground, that there's a lot of philosophy, in that as well. But it is ostensibly a work of literature, um, and it's not clear, that the views being espoused are Dostoevsky's own views. But the whole first half of the book pretty much is dedicated to just expanding his bitter misanthropic philosophy, and in that book you see the idea of madness. Well, I think it's in that book, but if not, in Dostoevsky's other work, you see him, contemplating the idea of a totally rationalized universe, and seeing that in many ways this would be the very last thing that humankind or a man, real man, would want, because he does not want himself to be reduced to just a cog in a perfectly ordered machine with no kind of sovereignty or unpredictability. He wants to be sovereign in a certain way, and to be kind of the master of his own destiny and the prime cause of his own life. And if everything is totally rationalized and just obeying certain preordained rules, and therefore presumably in theory predictable, this seems to completely prevent this kind of sovereignty that a true man really desires. And in his quote, he says, if the universe could be perfectly ordered, man would, just throw some kind of nonsense and rubbish into it, just to prove that he wasn't a piano key. And it's put in a very misanthropic way, in those paragraphs in Dostoevsky's book. But in fact, it's actually a very reasonable philosophical argument. Sorry, the camera's blurring up. You know, to me, it seems a very appealing idea. I mean, I'm somebody who loves thought for its own sake, and to me, the wilder an idea and the more kind of unlimited it is, the more appealing it is in many ways. And being a sophisticated person myself, I wouldn't, dismiss something just because somebody markets it himself as, mad in the way that I've done, or uses that kind of aesthetic. It's really a truism amongst the Illuminati or the enlightened, to not use such a loaded phrase, but it's a truism that to the enlightened individual, society itself seems mad, and also the thoughts of of genius or philosophy do themselves appear mad to the cave-like, commonplace society and preconceived opinions. So, so obviously, bearing that in mind, the idea of a book which openly presents itself as the ravings of a madman seems like almost the ideal environment and aesthetic for for real philosophy. So, I don't think that people will be put off by that. Obviously, some people will, but I think that some people are, intelligent enough to see past that, and it could be, a just the right level for them to actually gain some insight from. Because, I mean, I'm not saying that. uh, I don't know whether to assert, the the absolute, philosophical, the greatest merit for the ideas I've come up with, because they were, produced under a very tumultuous period, chaotic period, where my mind was genuinely very chaotic and not totally at its best. Uh, so whether this book would be of worth and interest to the very, very wisest and highest, human beings alive today, I would probably be somewhat doubtful. But uh, there are many, many books written, and many philosophy books written, where what's relevant is that there is some kind of connection between the level of the person who's writing it and the level of the person who's reading it, and or not just the level, but the shape of their mind, the mold of their mind. There's some kind of like connection or affinity there. Um, and I wrote this under the feeling, the conviction that it would shed a lot of light on, a lot of subjects for a lot of people. Um, and I'm still, I still believe that quite strongly. Um, and I mean, like I say, I mean, there's a huge number of books written, and they they're very, 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 very few of them are actually breaking new ground and new territory, and actually up there with the greatest thoughts that have ever been penned, by people like Nietzsche and Plato, um, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and and yet, to many people, they will be, more appealing even because, I mean, there's actually, a kind of like, kind of spiritual law whereby, in many ways, it's more difficult for somebody at a very, very, very high level to, to communicate and educate somebody at a very, very, very low level. Instead, it's better when the teacher and the pupil are, more at the same kind of level. So, for instance, a young person, a conscientious, teenager or young adult may be much, much better at teaching small children or teaching other children or young people than an older person, because they still remember very much what it was like to be, in the classroom, and to go through that developmental, childhood, etc. So it's just fresher in their mind, and they relate to it more, and they can directly, communicate the lessons which they themselves have just learned, and are still very fresh and real in their minds. In order to help people who are just coming slightly after them. Whereas somebody who's much older, they are going to be in a whole completely different universe, possibly. And they may have just completely forgotten about all of their childhood, and they come at it from some kind of possibly much too theoretical point of view, which actually forgets the lived experience of actual human growing up. Um, so in just the same way, I mean, you don't judge, you wouldn't judge every physics textbook negatively because it didn't contain all the very most complex latest theorems, etc. But it would be, as long as it contained a lot of true information well explained, there would be some audience for it. And I actually do think that the book that I've written, contains actually some genuine insight, which I don't even, see, in a lot of very, very educated people, or even in philosophy, in philosophers. So I'm not actually, saying that, this is just like some, philosophy for children, book, but it, but on the other hand, I think that I could still do better, and compared to something like Nietzsche, and his very, very mature philosophy, this is still a very immature book by me, and it contains a lot of the chaos and loose ends which have not been totally tied together, resulting from the iatrogenic, the medically induced shock and trauma sustained that I talk about in the book. And like I say, this being World Mental Health Day, this is in fact primarily more of a work of therapy, and it's about my own experiences and about subject of mental health rather than being a complete work of philosophy or something like that. But I talk about philosophy a lot because that is my main interest, and I do. I am arrogant and ambitious enough to try to try and present myself as a philosopher because I consider everything of importance to be part of philosophy. Like the old-fashioned view, that science was just like natural philosophy. Well, to me, philosophy is like the master science, the master subject, which is it contains it's about knowledge of the whole. So anything which is relevant to the whole, or in other words, anything which is really relevant, anything which is relevant to human life, comes under philosophy. So so I won't distinguish between psychology and philosophy particularly. For me, psychology is like the main branch of philosophy, more like that. And so the discussion of mental health issues is absolutely central to human life, and and it completely overlaps with the question of what is the meaning of life, and the most central questions of philosophy. And it's important to emphasize to anybody who is uninitiated out there that mental health cannot just be separated to some kind of like specialist subjects, and treated with no reverence or interest in the fundamental conundrums of human life. um, as they attempt to do at the moment. So this is one of the central premises of the book, or one of the central arguments of the book. And you see, um, to explain this subject honestly, which is the perspective the book takes. You see in the world today, it's very important to emphasize the absolute catastrophic and theatrically intense failure of the so-called mental health services, which seem to exponentially increase the very conditions which they ostensibly there to ameliorate and assist and heal. Instead, all the evidence is that mental health, but both mental health illnesses and mental health treatments are increasing very dramatically. And if you examine the nature of those treatments, it's pretty undeniable that those treatments are in fact the cause of the rise in the illnesses, or one of the main causes of the rise in the rate of illness. And if you think about these issues logically, for anybody who's not initiated already in what I'm saying, there are good reasons why that should be. Obviously, because the professionals who supply these so-called services are reliant for their income and their status on the continuation of these illnesses, and on their actual propagation and spreading throughout society. The more illness spreads, the more powerful the medical establishment become in society. That is a very simple logical point that it's very absolutely essential to grasp to understand the subject in any remotely a realistic way. And but then if you look at the actual nature of the treatments themselves, which is really the starting point, and it was for me because that is what I experienced firsthand, and what turned me so absolutely against the whole so-called services. It's filled with the most absolutely draconian violence and abject cruelty that any remotely decent person wouldn't even inflict on an animal. And so committing people, sectioning people, it's a form of grotesque violence which rides roughshod over their human rights, over their right to self-determination, one of the most flimsy pretexts, and it's comparable to a kind of intense, constant, chronic rape. The way to describe another word for sectioning would be chronic rape, because that's exactly what it is. It's violating the person, not just for half an hour or a few hours, in a genital manner, but although it often involves that as well because of the abuses of the system, but it's it's a chronic violation over weeks and months of the person's innermost sanctum of their being, their mind, their soul, through involuntary chemical manipulation and suppression. And when you are exposed to these toxic so-called medications and treatments, you do feel like you're being constantly raped chronically over months and months and months, or possibly years, or possibly your whole life. And every second you're on them, it's like your head's on the ground with somebody's boot on top of it, because first of all it creates literal pressure in the skull, so it's just like that. And it prevents your control of your own mind, your ability to to manifest your moment to moment personality as you actually choose. It completely prevents that, and you know it. You well know it. It's you know how you feel, and you know what's causing it. This is an imposition, which is a gross violation of the human rights, which if you let pass, well, you're mincemeat. If you let somebody do this to you, treat you like this with this level of contempt, you're set for you're set for Auschwitz, or in a few years' time, for you if the problem is that if you allow people to treat you with such contempt, then really the sky is the limit. Um, if your voice will not be heard, when you object to this, very real chemical invasion and suppression of your own mind, it creates an absolute terror in the victim, and a sense that he is absolute dirt to the perpetrators. Because literally, you are basically just a cash cow, which you're being injected with poison in order to make a few extra bucks for the pharmaceutical industry, and to anybody who is cognizant, and most people are cognizant to some degree, and most mental patients are highly cognizant to a very large degree of this dynamic, and that social dynamic creates intense rage in the victim, which obviously exacerbates, unfortunately, his situation. So it's this witch's brew of the brute chemical suppression and in violation of the mind, and then the intense sense of terror and rage and feeling of being completely devalued by society, which that chemical violation and suppression creates. It's a double blow, a twin combo, which causes the immense suffering and damage that is inflicted on psychiatric victims. And and these effects are mutually enhancing, so to speak, because the shock of the sectioning and the chemical suppression of the mind prevents one from being able to control one's intense rage and terror and horror at what is happening. So they're mutually reinforcing, creating basically a downward spiral of psychological destruction. Um, um, uh, and so that's why I was basically incapacitated for over 10 years, because of this 6 month incarceration in a mental health, so-called mental hospital. Although if it had not been for that incarceration, I would have been absolutely fine from what I was dealing with, in just a few weeks or a few months. Instead, it's been over 10 years, and that's my youth gone. And I'm just recovering now. And as you can see, hopefully see, if you have any intelligence yourself, I'm fairly articulate now. And, have a sense of, purpose and confidence, which was stolen from me. So, yes, again, important to emphasize, the best term would be chronic rape. That would be the term that I would replace, sectioning or involuntary treatment with, because uh, it's it's important to emphasize what is more integral to and essential to a human being. Is it their genital, is it their genital uh, self-determination? Is it their genital self-determination, or is it the determination of their own minds and their own souls? I mean, which is more distinctly human and more important to a human being? They're both very important, but the soul, the mind, and the soul, you know, by most accounts, it is the human being. It is the personality. The body is something that the human being, has access to and has possession over, um, or should have possession over legally, and and then he can use. But the mind itself is, the essence of the person and their personality, which is, of infinitely, greater importance and greater dignity, and it's infinitely more important that it's not violated. Um, so the fact that this happens routinely in our society, in our culture, and it's not called for what it is, or uh, it's not screamed about in the most extreme, so in the most powerful terms, is a great travesty, travesty of justice, and an absurdity from any moral point of view. um, uh, and it's when considering the subject, another very important thing to recognize is that the many people are tricked into becoming involved with the system, and then they regret it for the rest of their lives. Uh, um, there's this extremely pernicious, malicious advertising campaigns to get people to seek help, but they don't tell you what kind of help it is. They act as if the kind of help is irrelevant. You know, isn't that the most terrible, dangerous thing, insidious thing? Um, because it's the kind of help that is relevant. It's not just any help. Um, um, Once you start accepting help, which is bad for you put yourself in a very, very, very dangerous position, because then when you ask for help in future, you're going to get the same very bog standard and detrimental so-called help that you got to begin with. And there's or you might, and it's very difficult to get out of this spiral and this circle. So you're asking for help precisely to escape the help that has been inflicted on you previously, and that created in me, and it can create in somebody a very terrible linguistic catch-22 situation. So all of your expressions of distress and you ask for kind of help, um, are punished with exactly the kind of help that you are trying to escape from and asking for help to get away from. So how do you deal with that situation? It creates a sense of a completely mad world in which the people who are supposed to be caring for you and looking after you are imposing themselves on you and making things worse whenever you try to express, or you allow yourself to express, that something is not right with you, and that you genuinely do need some kind of real help. Um, so So this is obviously 1,000 or a million times worse than no help at all. Um, this is this is a nightmare, which is our psychiatric mental health system. This is a dynamic it routinely sets up in the way that it operates, and you see that in practically probably over 90% of the people who are labeled schizophrenic. Because what I guess what was they on? What is schizophrenic illness? It's talked about in terms of paranoia and and fear of fear of their government being after them or people being after them, and and um, and as a result, what happens? Well, their government imposes themselves on them and does genuinely terrorize them. So what are they supposed to do? They that's just going to intensify their view that the government is after them, that people are out to get them. And yet if they talk about it and explain their responses, it's just going to create the same feedback loop of creating more intervention which they didn't want and which terrorizes them. So so you see how illogical these things are. And uh, And so, if there's anybody who is, young and, naive out there, with any intelligence and still has hope for their own future, it would be it would be great if they could, hear what I'm saying and they could save themselves, a lifetime of horror. And and instead if you are this person, you could genuinely contribute something very positive to your own life and to society. And I don't see how that's bad for anyone. um so yes, it's so patronizing that they talk about just go and seek help. And oh, if you're unwell, if you're supposed to be brave and ask for help. It's such a a satanic trick, and so condescending and patronizing, because the kind of help that you're going to get is they're going to treat you like absolute shit. uh, and anybody who has any self-value um, would be very wise to stay well away from mental health services, because you want the kind of assistance and the kind of help that you really deserve. You don't want anything. You just don't want any kind of shit, masquerading under the banner of help. Um, um, and it's very disingenuous and wicked to assume that the most people, or um, that there aren't a huge number of people who who still do value themselves, who still do have some self-value, and they're not so desperate that they're just gonna voluntarily enjoy being stamped on like an ant by this insane system. There are lots of people who still do have value inside of them, and they, if they fall for this sales technique, this scam, then they're just going to be road rushed all over and waste years or possibly their whole lives because they were sweet fools and sweetly naive enough to believe that they were actually going to get, what's on the tin instead of genuine help. There are a huge number of young people who they actually, they have a lot of potential, and while they have like fears and doubts about life, what the heck are they supposed to do with their life? What is the meaning of human life? And that causes a great amount of confusion, growing up for some people, and possible, strange, erratic behavior. Doesn't mean that they are actually devoid of potential, and deep down they don't value their own lives. And that if they really thought hard about it and were pressed to the point in the right way, that they couldn't get control of their own lives and heal themselves from whatever maladies they are suffering from and make something of their lives. And they really could benefit from some genuine help. The help of an actual, somewhat enlightened individual, kind, enlightened individual who has a rational comprehension of issues. It can help cultivate their souls, in the way that Socrates did for the youth of Athens. And and by doing something like that, they can really flourish and achieve possibly great things. Whereas when you chemically invade their minds with these so-called medications, or you pathologize them in terms of like labels like schizophrenia or bipolar or depression, ADHD, or oppositional defiant disorder, or if you forcibly kidnap them using the power of the state, section them. All of these things are a huge step in the wrong direction that could possibly be permanent. So it's very wise, and it would be very good luck if people could, cotton onto this situation as much as possible. Or those who do have potential, still some intelligence or spiritual, quality and goodness inside of them, that they could cotton on to this wretched situation and simply adhere and stay true to their own path of education, rather than disingenuous, falsely marketed help. It's so important that people do not fall for cheap advertising labels, not just in the kind of clothes that they wear, but also in the kind of education and help they decide to choose when they're feeling adrift in life. And if you are if anybody's out there and listening to this, then and you think you might fall into this category, well, it's important to realize that you really are the future of the planet, and it's not selfish to take care of yourself and to go your own way, and to resist the mainstream herd conformity and the options which are open to you, and which you're kind of led by the nose towards. It's not selfish to resist that kind of tendency and to really, really take care of yourself. And you should take heart, and just be very joyful in your own existence, because the human race needs you, and people like you, and the planet needs you. And you don't have much reason to be so pessimistic and doubt yourself so much that you become so unhappy that you need to seek this kind of treatment, because what one of the big elephants in the room, and there are probably invisible elephants in the room, and there are probably quite a few, but one of them is that it's just about people not being given a proper sense of their self-worth by those around them and by society, which is an oversight or an absence which can be very much corrected by the right kind of intervention. Maybe just somebody going and telling them that, and allowing them to put value in themselves rather than trying to tear them down. So, if there are people out there who have been suffering from psychological malaise and misery and unhappiness and doubt and etc., and perhaps being labelled with mental illness, they should really ask themselves whether they have been getting this right input and really giving themselves the value and the reverence that they deserve, rather than believing that they've got some kind of disease or illness and that which has can be treated in pill form, has a chemical solution, and that they are that their emotions are invalid to a certain extent. They are defective. They should think deeply and ask themselves whether the problem isn't just that they perhaps they are just basically overrun and bewildered by the stupidity around them, by the cruelty around them, because the better people generally are when they're young. They're bewildered and dumbfounded by the stupidity around them, the cruelty around them. And that creates intense dysphoria in the young person or in the child. And that's not because they're defective and inferior, it's because they're superior. And in such a absolutely insane and pathological society, children in general are vastly superior to the adults and what's going on around them, because they are unsullied. They are unsullied nature. They still have their souls. They still have their potential. They come from God. They come straight from God. And they see the nonsense around them, the insanity and the brutality and the cruelty, pointless arguing, the attempts to shut them up for no reason, chemically and otherwise. And at some level, their consciences, they judge this world to be a terrible, terrible place. And that makes them feel very dysphoric and very unhappy. That's not because they're inferior, it's because they're superior. I mean, say there's a child genius, but he's kind of like, he spawns, somewhere, in the middle of nowhere among a bunch of rocks. Well, he's going to be, very unhappy. He's going to starve to death. He's going to wail and wail and wail and cry. His tears are going to be unexpiated, unredeemed. He's going to have a miserable, few hours or days of life crying. But it's not because he's defective and he's miserable. It's not because he's defective. This is a genius, a child genius, or a child god, but his environment is not catering to his needs and it's not matching up to him. It's just a bunch of stupid rocks. And if you look at this dynamic between most children, unsullied nature, pristine nature, with the corrupt society around them, well, it's almost like a newborn infant being distributed amongst a bunch of rocks. So the child becomes unhappy. He manifests pathological behaviors or emotions, and he doesn't fit in with the society because the society is not meeting up to his standards. It's not catering to his full potential. It's not providing the environment for him to flourish. and and as a result, it labels the child genius defective and creates creates him as the problem, and it's in its epitome of ignorance and cruelty. Um, so that's the kind of thought that I would like to leave people with for this special mental health edition, World Mental Health Day edition of Gaslit by a Madman, by myself, Max Louis, and my philosophically informed understandings and insights on the idea of mental health and the way it should be approached. Think in a deeply pathological and defective society, the healthiest and those with the most ripest with potential are the most pathologized. And that's why we see millions and millions of young children being chemically sedated and having their brain development ruined, while they're too sweetly oblivious to understand what's being done to them, or without any power to protest by those who are supposedly looking out for them. So that's the contrast. That is kind of the central dichotomy, in philosophy, nature and society, or nature and custom. And so I'd like to leave people, thinking about that dynamic, that dichotomy, in relation to this issue, and how unsullied and beautiful nature is being totally trampled on and corrupted by a totally sick society and adult world. So, the dynamic here in mental health, or the so-called mental health system, or services, is exactly the same dynamic that we need to think about when we consider philosophy.